Hi, I'm Kim Searle and I run Darn It workshops. I'm based in Huddersfield and I go all over West Yorkshire doing creative workshops in all sorts of different disciplines, but the main one we're going to be focusing today on is punch needle, which is one of my absolute favourites. It's this really gorgeous tactile technique and it's a really good way to transfer your drawings into something completely different, and it's really all about kind of texture, colour, and so if you're the kind of person who draws with like lots of details, I'll be going through how you can turn those details into something that's more like this and the process that you go through for that. And the tools that I'd use for that are mainly these punch needle tools, and you can get all sorts of different ones. So I've got an Oxford punch with me and a kind of adjustable one as well, and a small one for more detail. And generally this one is my favourite because it's really kind of ergonomic, fits in your hand really nicely, and you can get a really good speed up when you're working with it. But I do find some people find it a little bit tricky to work with, and everyone has different preferences. So I will show you how to use a few different ones and how to use different yarns and how they'll work and how thicknesses of yarn will work with all of these. Other things you'll need are some monk's cloth, which is this really kind of nice soft material that's really good to work with. You can also use hessian, which you can often get in like kind of old recycled coffee sacks, so it's a good way to upcycle things. That can be a bit trickier to work with. And you can use embroidery fabric as well. That's often too stiff, so I wouldn't recommend using that, but if you've got it in your house you can give it a go. You can also use this kind of linen, which this one's on, so you can see a little bit of it there, and that works really nicely and you get a really good base colour. Another thing you'll need is an embroidery hoop, and I would always recommend on the centre bit putting some cotton tape or just a long strip of fabric around it, just because that helps with the tension. Because with this, there's a lot of, as the name suggests, punching things, so you're constantly punching into the fabric, so as you do it, it's going to loosen in this quite a lot. So it's always good to have this on because it just helps with the friction of it and helps hold it in for a little bit longer. If you don't have one of those, you can always use a wooden frame like this and pin it in, but as you can see this is fraying quite a lot around the edges, so that's something that can happen with that. Or you can use one of these kind of embroidery frames where you can tighten it that way. And I'm trying to think what else. So I'd recommend as well having some masking tape, because then you can put it around the edges, because all of the fabrics we'll be using today do fray quite a lot. So it's always good to have something to stop that happening, and it just means that you get a lot more life out of your fabric rather than it all fraying on you as you're working with it. And also good things to have with you are some scissors, a Sharpie to draw your design on, and I would recommend when you're doing your drawings to use Posca pens, so I've got loads of them here, and you can just do some really good block colours to get a good idea of how everything's going to look. So normally, I don't know about how you draw, but the way I do is in quite a lot of detail. So when you're doing things like this, you have to kind of simplify them down to how they're going to look in yarn. So if I hold this one up against here, if you've got loads of different colours going on like this, it's going to be really, really hard to replicate it because you're constantly going to be changing things. Like something like this, I would recommend doing more kind of in embroidery rather than punch needle. But if you did want to do it in punch needle, I would simplify it down to its most basic elements, so you'd end up with something that looks like this. So rather than lots of little details, you'd have lots of nice colour blocks. And for things that have more texture in them, like if you wanted a sky like on this one where it's got lots of different kind of watercolour bits, you could use a variegated cord to change the colour that way. And let's find another one. Something like this, again, it's a bit bolder, but it's got all of these different colour changes, so that would be a bit easier to do. But with this bit, it would end up being just a big block of blue. So all of these are inspired by all of the gorgeous scenery around Otley. So we've got lots of images of the River Wharf and of the Chevin. So that, if we reduced it to that, you've just got so much blue that it's not actually going to be that interesting to do, and you're going to get bored doing half of this. So it's always good to reduce it down. Again, this is one where big blocks of blue. So it could look nice because with these kind of bits, you can change it so that you've got lots of different kinds of blue going on with it. So you've got white bits going in through it. So I've kind of simplified that down to this one, where you'd have bits of kind of nice fluffy yarn coming through here. But again, might end up a little bit boring. So when you're choosing an image that you want to do for something like this, I'd recommend going for something where you're really simplifying it down to things like this. So on this one I haven't even added colour, and then you can kind of drag and drop what you want it to look like afterwards. So with this one, not that one, this one. So again, we've got a big bit of blue here, but we've got lots of different nice colours to work on here. So there's not loads of different bits that are going to become complicated, but you can just reduce it to these really nice colours, and that works really well with punch needle to get something that's a bit more like this. So I tend to find that the more colours you do in it, it can end up looking a bit muddled and not looking like what you want it to. Whereas if you've got something that's really, really reduced, it works out really well for your design. So the main way to do that is to do your design and then copy it out, and you're going to get rid of any small details. Like in my drawing, I do loads of mark making and things like that. But with that, we're not going to add the mark making to this because it's just going to complicate it. So for this bit, I'd always have this in front of me and this one. So I know on these sections over here, I want a yarn that's quite rough. So I'd go for something a bit more like this one. Whereas on the top section here, there's not really any texture to it. So I go for something much smoother, so that it's just got that nice kind of matte finish to it. So first thing to always do is cut out your monk's cloth or other fabric that you're using, and I'd always make sure that it's way bigger than the frame that you're using, because it does fray quite a lot. But I would always put a bit of masking tape around the edges just to make sure that it's not going to fray as much as it could do. So I've done most sides here, but I'll just do the last one to show you how to do it. So just any masking tape will work. If I can find the end of it, there we go. So you just unroll it, and not the best masking tape. So pop it along the edge so it's kind of half and half like that. And this side's already kind of like sealed off, so it's not so much of a problem. But just for demo's sake, so you'd pop it along the bottom like that, bring it off, and then fold it over to the other side so it's kind of locking it in. And it does make a whole world of difference as you do this. And it just saves you loads of fabric and means you've got way less hassle later. So just make sure it's as unsticky as possible, and then lay it out nice and flat like that. Get your embroidery hoop, and I would put the middle bit to the back that's been pre-covered in either cotton tape or a strip of fabric, and you just wrap that around and then tie it in like that. It doesn't have to be particularly neat, but it does make such a difference. And then pop that underneath and make sure it's as kind of central as possible. Pop your hoop on top and just push it down, and that's the easiest way to get it on without any hassle. And it's always good at this point to spend a bit of time just making sure that it's really firmly on there, that there's no creases, and then tighten it as much as you possibly can. If you've got a tiny screwdriver, you've got one that's got a little bit to put a screwdriver in, that can really help. This one doesn't, but you want to make sure it's as tight as it possibly can be as you do it. And just pull it all out at the sides as well. And you'll probably have to redo this quite a lot as you go, because it does lose tension really, really easily. And then I'd recommend getting a marker pen, so a Sharpie works really well for this. And then getting your images that you're going to work from. And you can always add in little bits of detail. Like I often find I'll make little notes on this of what kind of textures I need, but you can always just have your images in front of you as well. So it's always good to start with a really kind of good main bit. So I'm going to go for this skyline that's along here. So I know that's sort of about a quarter of the way down. I'm just going to roughly draw that on. And you do find a lot of the time as you do this, it changes as it goes. So don't feel like you have to stick to it too solidly. So we've got some of the moors in the background there. And for this bit, I'm just going to draw on some little bits of texture there. So I know that when I do that bit of wool, I want to have a textured wool rather than a flat piece here. And then add in all of your little details. You can completely freehand this as well, but I always think it's nice to work from your sketchbook. And then some of these clouds, I want to make them a little bit fluffy, and some I want to make a bit flatter. So we're going to draw all of those in. And all of this is going to get completely covered up with yarn, so you don't have to worry about it. But you can get pens that disappear as you work with them, but I personally don't use them because I tend to find I don't always do these in one go. So if it's one that I'm going to put down and come back to later, it's always good to have something that's going to stay there and you don't have to worry about it too much. So that bit, so that's this one over here. So I'd be looking at this for the texture and then I'll go to this one for the colour later. Then draw those on, and I always find I get to a bit where I know I've missed something out, but that's okay. So I'm going to start at the rocks at the bottom. So these are all some of the rocks on the chevin. So I know these two bits are going to be different colours, so I'm just doing a line there to indicate that. And then fill in all of those bits in as I go. And it's always good to not rush this bit too much. And make sure you've got all of those details in. And when you've put in bits like this, you can see that that bit intersects up there, so you know which bit you're doing next. And then we'll get on to some punch needle very soon. So got onto that bit there. So this is all different types of trees. So you can always do this as a big block of green, because this is just all sorts of different trees. So when I looked at images of it, they're all mostly the same colour, but I always think that gets a bit boring. And you can always do loads of different types of green instead. So we've got that all on there, ready to go. So the next thing to do is to get your punch needle. So I'm going to start with one of these. So this is an Oxford punch, and they're really lovely to work with because they just fit in your hand really, really nicely. And I find with this kind of stuff it works brilliantly. If you're working on something like Hessian, it would work quite nicely, but you could get away with doing something a little bit thinner. And if you're working on needle cross-stitch fabric, kind of like Ada, I would go with something that's much finer than this one, because this will just, if I go into this, just makes big holes in it and makes it a bit of a nightmare to work with. The other thing is, this one's really nice and easy to thread, whereas the next one I'll be using doesn't have that function. So with this you can change colours really quickly. So on something like this, when it's loads of different colours going on, it's always good to use that one. And I'm going to start at the top and work my way down. So at the top it's all of these clouds, and on here it might not show up because I've done a few different types of white on it, but I know they all look mostly the same, but I'm going to go for different colours of white and cream so it stands out a little bit. And with this one, it works really well with quite chunky yarn. So if you're using something like this kind of thing, I would double it up. But a good way to check is to try it single first. And you thread it through there, and then pop it down the middle, and it's ready to go. And I'd always recommend unravelling a little bit as well, because you tend to find if you've got only a little bit unravelled, then there's a little bit too much tension on it, and as you work with it, it's just going to keep popping out. Because you tend to find with punch needle, the main things you have to worry about are the thickness of the yarn you're using and the tension of the material that you're working on. So if I try this in the corner, so you push it in all the way, bring it out, and then go along one. So that's working quite nicely. But on the other side, there's quite a big gap between it, so I definitely need to double that one up. And the way we're working on this is we're working on the back of it, so this side's actually going to be the front, but you can swap it over as you go as well, and do a bit of this kind of thing, where you've got a really flat area and then some bobbly areas. So on this side, I've swapped it over, so this is technically the back of it, but it just gives you a nice different texture. So double that up, so you always just want to unwind a bit so you've got a good amount of doubled up stuff to work with. And you could always do this with two different colours as well if you wanted a bit of texture going on. And thread it through there, and you always want to make sure there's a little bit coming out that end so it's not like that. And if it's coming out the middle like that, you just want to pull it through until it's going through that channel there. And then I'm going to start at the top here, and it's really tricky to get all the way to the edge of the hoop. So don't worry about getting too close to it. So you push it in, bring it out, and as you bring it out, the main mistake people make is pulling it out too far. But what you want to do, put it in, bring it out, and then you just kind of graze the top of that fabric and go in. And kind of go in at a bit of an angle, so you're not going in that way. You're sort of holding it like you'd hold a pen. And you just keep going along like that. And I would always turn it over and check, and you can see that's coming through quite nicely, and we've got quite a nice texture going on. And there's a few different types of punch needles you can use. And this one's nice because it does work with that kind of thicker cord, whereas some of the other ones I use only work with really thin yarn. So it takes a lot longer to do. So when you get to the end of something, you just turn it around so that that channel bit is facing in the direction that you're going. And then you keep going, and you're doing it not massively close to it, but just slightly underneath it. And you just keep on going like that, and after a while you do get a good bit of speed. And often this is the point when people realise it's going wrong, and it might be because some of this isn't unwound or it's trapped under your arm. I find a lot of the time if people do crochet, they get in the habit of wrapping it around their arms like that, and that goes a little bit wrong, but that's a nice texture going on there. So then again, to go back, turn it round while it's still in, and just keep going on. And we're getting to the bottom of that cloud. See, that's getting trapped under there, and I could feel there was a little bit of tension on it. And twist around and keep going along here. So when you get to the end of it, actually, I'll do a little bit more there just to fill that cloud in. So when you get to the end, you pop a finger on there to stop it coming out, kind of hold it down, pull that through, and then get your scissors, just somewhere in here. Trim it off, and I would leave a little bit of a tail, and then you can trim those all down afterwards. So that is my first cloud. So to change colour, you just do the same thing again, and this time I'm going to go for something a lot fluffier, and depending on the texture you use, it will come out a little bit different, and it will work a bit differently. So because this has got so much texture, it might be a little bit harder to work with, because it's going to be a bit resistant to moving as freely. So you just want to make sure it's all the way through in there, and then you just get going again and just zoom along, not trying to get too close to the embroidery hoop. And this is already, after that tiny bit, getting a little bit looser in the frame. So I would recommend that if you feel it getting really slack, you just keep tightening it up. And the best way to do that is just pull the sides out. Mine hasn't quite got to that stage yet. But if you feel it going really, really floppy, that's often how people lose the tension on it. And then you start skipping stitches. So if you're giving this a go at home and you're finding you're not going at the same speed I'm going, don't worry, this is after lots of practice. And I do find this is one of those crafts where the first probably half an hour of doing it is really stressful. Like, I remember when I first started to learn how to do it, I was given all of the materials to basically learn how to do it and teach people how to do it. And I was trying it at home, and I was just so frustrated that I couldn't get the hang of it. And then I just did a few troubleshooting things, like changing the thickness of the yarn, changing how tight the material was, and it made all the difference. And I find a lot of the time as well, it's purely down to the material that you're using. Like, I've had a lot of people telling me that they've bought some punch needle kits, and the material that comes in it is like kind of Ada cross-stitch fabric. So again, when you get to the end, chop it off like that. And with that, if you're using it for the first time, it's so hard to work with. So we've got some really nice different textures going on there. So what you can always do here is turn it over and do another one from this side, so you've got a bit of a change. So if I hold that up a bit to the light, I can kind of see the pattern of this coming through. So I'm just going to draw on that so I know that cloud's there, so the next one will be a different level. So if you're doing it this way, if you look at the back of this one, compared to this is so far apart and really badly spaced, but it doesn't matter because this is going to be the back of it. So you can always do that so that you're not going to use as much cord. I keep saying cord, it's yarn. So if you're doing it this way, as you go in, you'd bring your little tail bit and you'd pull it through from the other side just so that it's not on this bit. And you don't have to be as close with your stitches here. You can literally just go along like this. You just want to really make sure that this is really loose at the back and that you're putting the needle all the way in. I find often when people do this, the thing that goes wrong is that they're not pushing the needle all the way in. And as you bring it out, you want to do it quite slowly as well. And then as you go back, you kind of go in between each stitch. So on this one, you're going to put the needle next to where the last one finished so that they fit together really, really nicely. And you can always go a little bit further apart like that as well if you want to. And if I show you the back of it, it's looking awful on there, but we're not going to see that bit, so it's not a problem. And you can just keep going like that. And if you do this way, you can always use the same yarn twice and do it in opposite sides. So if I did another cloud in the same one underneath this, it would look different and it would look like a distinctly different cloud just because it's a different texture. So this is a bit more kind of like, not so much more like traditional embroidery, but you can sort of draw with this. I've seen a few people do whole bits of punch needle this way, but I always think then you end up with so much texture on the back that it's a bit nicer to kind of vary it and have some bits on the front, some bits on the back. It almost looks like little seeds on this side, so it's quite nice. I often find myself doing the sky this way because then you've got a really flat sky against lots of different kind of mountains and fields and stuff, and it just makes it a bit more distinct. So this bit here, I've clearly got ahead of myself and it's not quite gone in. So if that happens, you can always just take it back a little bit, make sure this is through the middle, and you want to make sure there's no slack on this bit, and then just keep going and just make sure you're doing it a little bit slower and a bit more controlled than you have been. And then when you get to the end of this one, so you go back to this side and cut it from here rather than the front. So then you've got all of your tails over here and you don't have to worry about them. I always think the back of it always looks quite nice as well. So next, let's go for the same one, but on the right side, so we get a nice different texture again. Plus, it's already loaded in there. This is the nice thing about this one. I often find at home, I've got loads of different punch needle tools and I'll have them all with different colours so I can kind of swap between them lots. The problem with some of the fluffier ones, actually threading it up can be a little bit trickier. There we go. So back onto this side and we'll just fill, in fact let's do this one over here. So again, we're leaving the tail on this side now because all of the messy bits can be on here. And I don't tend to cut them down as I go. I tend to leave it until the end and then trim it all up. Just because if you change your mind on anything, it just means that you've got that little bit of extra yarn to work with. So turn around and go back into this side. So this is definitely starting to get a little bit more slack. Once you've got the hang of it, it's a really nice thing to do, just kind of in an evening, watching the TV, especially as it's getting a little bit colder. So we'll bring that side around here. So if you ever get to the end of it, just make sure that you've got a tail, get another bit, and pop it on and keep going. This is when I can't find the tail on this one. There we go. it's always hard to predict how much yarn you're going to need because it depends on the thickness of it, how big your stitches are, and all of that kind of thing. There we go. And then keep filling it in like that. You can get so many lovely textured wools that you can end up, even if you did it all in the same colour, but different kinds of textures, it would still look lovely. I've seen a few really nice ones online that are just all kind of creams and beiges, which doesn't sound like it would be good, but they look amazing. So that's how that's going. And I'm going to try, where did I put it? This one over here. Ooh. It might be a little bit too thick, but we'll give it a go anyway. I think I have used it on another one, so it should work. But I'd say I wouldn't go any thicker with your yarn than this. Might not work, might not. No, if it's not fitting through there, it's not going to work. Which is a shame because that would have looked quite nice. Let's go for another one of these. This is nice and easy to use. Side was on. There we go. Oh yeah, so because this is getting looser, if it's getting looser to the point where it's quite hard to tighten it, you can always just take it off, pop it back on, make sure that you don't get your tails caught in it, and just push it down again, just to kind of reset it, because it does make such a big difference if it's a little bit tighter. And you can always get a wooden frame and pin it to it. But the problem with that is sometimes it can damage the monk's cloth as you go around it. It's one of those crafts that's just so relaxing as well, so you can just really get in the zone with it. But often when you do that, that's when you make little mistakes, so it's always good if, like, you feel yourself doing that, just to slow down a little bit. Because I always find when I do this as a workshop, there'll be a point when everyone gets it and they're really, really in the zone, and then they'll be doing it perfectly, and after a while they'll turn it over and realise they skipped a load of stitches. So it's always good to keep checking the back and just make sure that it's all there and you don't have loads of blank areas. And as you're going along, you're always just going kind of a couple of rows in the monk's cloth. And there's another sort of fabric like this that you can get at the moment that's made for rug tufting, and that tends to be a grey fabric, and because rug tufting is done similarly to this, but you use a kind of a gun that you load with yarn and it kind of shoots it into some material, and because that's made for like massive rugs, you can generally get that material in bigger quantities for a little bit less. Like, not much of a price difference, but it's nice stuff to work with as well. And I'd always kind of work in rows, like I wouldn't jump back and forth like this. It'd always just be straight lines or kind of going round in a circle. And the other nice thing with this kind of fabric is that if you make any mistakes, you can really easily unpick it and it doesn't damage the fabric. Whereas if you're doing this on linen or hessian, you can still reuse it after you've made some mistakes and unpicked them, but it does leave a little hole in the fabric and it makes it a little bit harder to work with. I always get to this kind of point when I'm doing the same colours. I'm just like, no, going to go on to another section. So you can always do that as well. I tend to always try and work from the top down. But if you want to move on to anything else, you can do that as well. So if I just fill in that last bit of the cloud, and then I will do that sun before going back to it. And it's a little bit quicker than stuff like kind of embroidery. Where's the good stuff? There we go. Things like embroidery and rag rugging, which I do a lot of, and they're both really good fun, but this is that little bit quicker and you can build things up much speedier. So with this one, I'm going to swap over to one of my other things, just for kind of a bit of a change. So the nice thing about this one is you can change the height of your stitches. It's a bit of a nightmare to thread though. So what you do is, they normally come with a little bit of metal like this, and you put it through the top of the needle, and it should come out the bottom like that. And then get your doubled up thread, because again this one works with slightly thicker yarn. Pull it through the top, and then it goes through that eye again. So it does mean if you're changing colour lots, it's a little bit annoying. So what I would tend to do with something like this is use it, and then like, I've only got one yellow section on here, but if I was doing this with a brown one, I would do all of the brown bits at the same time, so I didn't have to keep changing over. And at the moment it's on a kind of standard stitch, but if you go to that one, it will be much longer. And if you went all the way down to the bottom, it will be much shorter. But we're going to stick to, I think we'll go for that one. And if you go for the shorter ones, it is really tricky and you tend to skip a lot of stitches. So with a circle, you can either start somewhere on the outside or somewhere in the middle, but generally if you start in the outside, you end up with one bit that's a slightly off circle. So it's always good to start in the middle, put it through, and then just kind of work around that in a spiral. And just keep kind of twisting it as you work with it as well. I often find when you do this as well, you get a little bit hunched over, so it's always good to roll your shoulders every so often. One of those ones that you can focus on quite a lot and not realise what you're doing with your body. So you just keep doing little spirals around that, and eventually you get to the outside of it and you've got a lovely circle going on. And it's always quite nice if you do this with the whole thing as well, and if you do a big spiral thing with lots of different colours. There's so many options depending on what kind of drawing you do. And there's always a way to translate it into this kind of craft. And this tool has a slightly different feeling to the other one. I always find with the Oxford Punch, you can do it really speedily, whereas with this one, it's got a little bit more resistance, and you have to be a little bit slower with it, which is quite nice on something like this, where you have to concentrate on what it's going to look like a bit more. But on the clouds, where it's a bit more just kind of filling in lines, it's a bit frustrating. So that one's about the same height as that one, but if I use this tool again in a moment, I'll show you how you could change the height and get some really nice different textures going on. I always think these spiral bits look really nice on the back as well, because it's just very, very neat, other than the big tail in the middle. I know that I'm getting to the end of my yarn. There we go. So at some point that will just finish off. And because I'm going to work back into that bit, I'm just going to trim that one down a little bit and do the same thing again. But what I might do is continue it with this one, just because it's going to be the same height as that, and this one's a little bit easier to work with. Go back into the next one, and I know that I've started my circle not dead in the centre, so it does mean it's going to be in a slightly different place to where I planned, but that's okay, that happens. It still means it's going to be a nice even circle. I find a lot of the time when people first do this, they get a bit worried about the noise it makes as you go in, and they think it's kind of ripping the fabric, but you don't have to worry about it. It's really good, sturdy material that isn't going to have an issue. But this one's quite soft on it anyway. So I'm going to make my sun a little bit smaller than I meant it to be. finish it up about there and bring that through. Now that we've done some of the bits that are all kind of the same colours on the top, we're going to do a big section of blue, and then I'll go on to all of these bits at the bottom that are all different colours. And I think with the blue section, I'm going to do what I do with a lot of the skylines and do it in reverse, so that these bits really stand out against it and you've just got a different texture going on. And you can always, if you're doing sky, you can do it in a few different colours, or you can stick to the same. So with this one, I'm just going to do this on the wrong side. So again, when you do that, you pull it through to the other side, so you've got all of the tails over there. And it's kind of tricky when you're doing it like this and you're going in between bits, so you just have to be really, really careful how you go, and always make sure there's not too much slack on this side. And we're just going to try and fill it in as best we can. You kind of have to put the needle in between these two, so it works to kind of wiggle them out the way like that, and then you can just get a nice bit of sky coming through. And the yarn I'm using now is like a cotton yarn, so it's a little bit thinner than the ones I've been working with. So you have to try and make sure when you're doing something like that that isn't quite as fluffy, that you do it really close to the last bits you've been working on, so that you can't see the bits of monk's cloth coming from between. So you have to be a little bit careful with this bit, but not too tricky. And normally I would go around this bit so we get the fluffy bits on the other side, but because I'm wanting it to be nice straight lines where I can see it on this side, I'm going to go back this way and fill this bit in so that it's all going in the same direction and it's really nice and neat. But if you're not so bothered about that, you can just kind of go anywhere you like really, but I want some nice straight lines on it, so I'm just going to keep going like that. And when I get to this bit, I'm not going to bother about going back there, because I'll fill that bit in later, because it's easier to just keep going backwards and forwards this way. And if it helps, just always move your hoop around and make sure you're going in a direction that makes it easier. And sometimes when it's a texture like this, you find it jumps out of the hook a little bit. So every so often you just have to correct it. So weirdly, often the fluffier ones work a little bit better, but this is such a nice colour and it's just going to be a different texture. And I always think that with punch needle, a lot of the beauty of it is using loads of different textures, different colours, different materials to build it up to make something that you just want to touch. It's such a kind of squishy craft and just really, really tactile. But this one is a little bit tricky to work with, so I just keep pulling it out the way like that, so it's not getting all jammed up in here. And on the back, this is probably going to look very messy like that, but we don't need to worry about that because we're not going to see that bit. And after I've done this bit, it will be a lot easier to fill in the rest. You just always have to go a little bit slow as you're filling in all of these gap bits. And with the Oxford punch, you can't change the height of it, which is a bit frustrating, but you can get different Oxford punch tools. So if you wanted one that had a slightly kind of higher pile than this one, you could get another one, and you can get ones that work a little bit better for thin materials as well. But it does mean that you're getting loads of different tools for each project. So if you want something where you're doing loads of different heights and textures, well, heights and thicknesses of yarn, I recommend going with another tool to this. So if you're using one like this and you want to change heights, I'd always recommend doing a little test on the corner just to see how high it's going to come out and if it's kind of what you want it to look like. If I redo that bit again. So you put it in, bring it out, and just do another few just to double check. And it's really hard doing it on the corner just because you don't have the tension to hold it in. But that's going to be much taller than the other bits we've done. So that's going to work quite nicely, because I'm going to do that for some of this skyline, just so it really stands out against it. So again, you make sure you've only got a little tail, And then we're going to do it on the other side now, so we get the loopy bits over that side. And with these, you don't have to go quite as close as you have been doing, just because with it standing up a little bit taller, it's going to hide all the bits in between. But you want to be really, really careful if you're doing a bit that you've just, right next to a bit that you've done on the wrong side, that you're not catching them into it. So the first line I'd be really, really careful with, and then you can kind of keep zooming along a little bit speedier. So if I turn this over, you can kind of see how tall that is compared to the last one. And what I tend to do quite a lot with this one is do 1 or 2 rows of this and then reduce the height so that it gets shorter as it goes. And when it's a little bit longer, it is quite hard to control it, just because you're having to push it in so much further. So it shouldn't make much of a difference, but it does, because you're having to put a bit more effort in, and you have to lift it off the table a little bit more so you're not completely jabbing it all the time. So if I just do another row of that one, so again, just turn it around. And the nice thing with this one is you can get some other ones that change heights, but often they have contraptions where they kind of change height quite easily when you don't want them to, whereas ones like these, they're quite nice and easy to use and they stay in the right position. They are a little bit sharper than the other ones though, and I've never had any kind of injury from it, but I would be a little bit careful with your fingers just to make sure they're out of the way. And if I turn that over again, you can see how high it is in comparison. So I tend to do a couple of rows like that. Ooh. And this is the thing, with this one you do run out of your yarn a lot quicker just because it's so much taller. So it's not showing through in there, but sometimes if that happens, you can see how it gets much less dense over here. So I'm just going to rethread that. So this is the one that's a tricky one to thread. I'm going to use that as an opportunity to change the height. So for that one, you just click it down like that, nice and easy. And then get a threader, pop it through the top like that. And this is a threader that I've made myself, because sometimes the ones that come in the packs are a little bit short. So this one, it's just a bit of wire bent in half with a little loop on the end. And it just makes it nice and easy to pull through. And then you can keep going again. So we might find that we've got a slightly thinner area around there, but that's okay. You can always go back over it a little bit if you want to, but I'm probably going to leave it. So I'm just going to fill in this bit over here. And it's already so much speedier just because it's not quite as high as the last one. So not having to go in quite as far, and you can just zoom along a little bit easier. And you can keep making it shorter as you go. So it's got a real kind of gradient going on. And this one is slightly harder to work with, but some people find this one easier as well. So if I do another row on that height and then move it down again, and then you can see the difference between all of the different heights. Again, leaving a good bit of space around the edge, just because it's really hard to get all the way to the side of the embroidery hoop. And making sure that you've always got a good bit unwound next to you so that you're not getting any kind of weird tension going on. Looking incredibly dense. So if you turn it over and it's really, really thick like that, you can always leave a little bit more space in between. Now I'm going to click it down to the next setting. So it just keeps getting shorter as it goes. And I'm going to run out of it there. So what I'm going to do is just cut that off so I know when it's run out, rather than keeping going with one strand of it. Because if it goes down to one strand, it's not going to go through properly and we might end up with some missed stitches. It's always good, rather than threading it so you've got loads and loads, I always tend to do little bits at a time, because if you've got a massive tail, then it's more likely to get tangled as you go. So it's always good to rethread it rather than working with too much of it. But you can sort of see there it getting shorter and shorter as it goes. So if I do a bit more with that one and then click it down to the smallest setting, so this one always feels a bit more abrasive on the fabric, so that's why it might be a little bit louder than the last one. And then I'm going to click it down to the last one. So I often find the shortest one is a little bit harder to work with, and you have to make sure that you do your stitches really, really close together and you're not putting too much tension on it at all, because it does tend to skip stitches much more easily. Like I think there's a couple skipped there, but that's okay, because when it's all kind of together, it's going to look all right. But it's if you get a whole row of them, it can be quite tricky. I can feel this is getting a little bit loose in the frame, so it's about time to take it out and put it back in again. So I cut that one off, and you can see how that starts really, really tall and it just gets much shorter towards the bottom. There's a couple bits here where a little bit of the monk's cloth has kind of like come out between the fabric, and that's just where it's been pulled on a little bit too much, and that's to do with the tension of the fabric. So it's definitely time to give it a bit of a refresh, flatten it all down and pop it back in the frame again. Make sure it's as tight as it can possibly be. So that section's the same colour as this one, so I do these two at the same time, kind of a bit like a paint by numbers, so you don't have to kind of go back on yourself, especially with this one, and keep rethreading it. So that one is, so we're going to go for, this is when you realise, when you look at it, that you've got some of the bits you're going to do confused. So I think this is this bit, but it's not too much of a problem, it will still look similar. So we're just going to fill this one in, and I've put it back to, on this one it's setting C, just because it's a little bit easier to work with than the ones that are a bit shorter or a bit longer. It just means that it's already loaded up, ready to go. And by this point you should have kind of got to grips with it, and it makes it that little bit easier to fill it in once you know what you're doing, and you don't have to work so much from the top down. You can just do any bits you like. we've got down to one bit of yarn, so we're going to swap that over. And oh, there's not that much of this one left, so what I'll do is I'll pop it in this one instead, just because this one is a little bit easier to use when it gets to the end of it. Pop that through there. So we might go on to a different brown on that one, but that's okay. That happens sometimes. It's a really good way as well to like use up the ends of bits of yarn. So if you do other crafty things, like if you knit or if you crochet and you've got some ends of balls from projects, it's a nice way to like get loads of different colours and things like that entwined in it. But of course you can buy new bits for it as well. So we're going to go for a kind of orangey brown instead, and this one's quite thick, so it might go through on its own. So we'll give it a little test. And it's always good to test on the corner like this. We'll see how it's going to do. Yeah, I think that's going to be all right. I'd say that's kind of on the borderline where if it was even slightly thinner, I would double it up. So I'm just going to fill this section in. And because it's a bit thinner, just going to go a little bit closer together than I'd normally do. And there's such a difference between the last tool I was working with and this one. This one, just zooming along very, very easily. And it's coming out really nicely and evenly. And just always make sure to unwind it a little bit like that. So the thinner stuff I'm using is double knit yarn. So if you're using double knit, I would always double that up. But if you're using something like a chunky yarn, that tends to be okay on its own. So it's always nice on one like this when there's loads of different colours, because I tend to find if I'm doing really big patches of colours, it just gets really boring. Whereas if you've got different textures and things that you can work with, it's a really nice change of pace, because each kind of wool that you use will feel really different as you work with it. Like you might use some stuff and realise that it's just not for you. Like there's certain, like that cotton cord there wasn't that much fun to work with, but this just flows through this really, really nicely. So it's much easier to fill bigger areas. Can be quite hard to colour match your yarns to your drawings as well. So I always think it's quite good to be quite flexible about it. And just go with what looks best with the other colours you're using, rather than trying to be really exact with it. So then we can use this one while it's already on there to fill in some other sections. So it always starts to look a bit odd when you do this, when you're doing all different areas, because at the top you can see what it's going to look like, but this bit you have to wait until it's all filled in to see how it's going to be. But it's always just quite a nice surprise at the end. If there's any bits that you do that you're not happy with, you can always just undo them. So we're on, so I'm going to do this bit down here. And sometimes when you do a section like this, that's like right at the bottom, away from all of the other bits you do, it can be quite tricky because you're suddenly filling in an area that doesn't have any other of these bits of tension to kind of stabilise it as much. So it might feel a little bit different. And I would say I wouldn't do any areas smaller than this one, because if I turn it over, you can see what that's going to be, but if it was even a little bit smaller, it would get a little bit lost in all of the other colours around it. So these little areas I've done here, I might miss some of those off unless they're a very similar colour to the bits around it. And yarn like this as well, that's chunky but quite smooth, is really good to work with. When I get to these rocks at the bottom, there's a couple of yarns that are going to be really, really textured, and sometimes they don't move through the tool quite as well, and they can be a little bit tricky to work with. So if you get little gaps like this, I wouldn't worry about it too much unless you look at the other side and it's obvious. So I think there's maybe one more area of this kind of brown. So we've got another rock somewhere. So I'd always make sure as you're doing this, that when you're doing all of the colourful bits, that you count how many of each colour you've got on here. So I've got an extra bit of this one because I ran out of that colour, but then we've got 4 other little bits on here, so I know that I'm on my last one of those now. Because I often find when I transfer my image, I end up realising that some of it, I've moved some of the lines of bits, and it's a good way to check that you've got all of the same elements in that you had in your original drawing. It's like on this bit, I realised I'd only done 4 bits of this kind of orangey brown, and I had to do an extra bit and go through it and work out which bits I hadn't included from that. So then when you're done with that one, you can put it to one side and you know that you're done with that colour. So unless you end up with an area where you think it would look really lovely, you don't have to worry about it too much. So all of these little areas, once there's other bits to hold them together, it will start to look a bit more like this, where it's all kind of squashed up and it really starts to come together. So now I'm going to use a bit of a purple, which wasn't in my original design, but these bits up here are all of the kind of moors around this area. And at the moment, they are looking really, really lovely with lots of heather out. So I thought last minute, let's add some heather in. And this one's kind of like a marled wool. So it's got kind of different flecks of colours in. So it looks really, really lovely against all of the bits that are more solid colours. So it's always nice to have a really good selection like that. So I'm going to use this instead of some of these grey bits of moors. So I think it might only be one tiny bit of it, but it's just a nice extra little element to add in. And when you see it getting to the end of a bit there, it's always good to snip it off, just so that you don't end up using a single strand for a little while. There we go. So I'm doing this one in all quite kind of realistic colours, but a lot of the time when I do scenes like this, it's a bit more like this kind of thing, where it's all just bright neon colours and kind of clashing things. So you don't have to stick to something that looks this natural if you don't want to, but you can always use it so that it matches your drawing style. And I've seen some incredible punch needles that people have done where their main thing is that they're illustrators, and when they do their things as punch needle pieces, it's just such a lovely way to interpret it and see a kind of different side to it. So sometimes when I'm filling in areas like this, if I realise there's little bits that I've missed, you can always just jab back into it quite easily, and it doesn't matter so much if you go over the line. So there's a little bit up here where I've missed it. So if that happens, sometimes it won't be visible from the front, from the back even. So if you kind of try and work out where it is, put your finger on it, and then obviously don't punch into your finger, but you know where you're going, and you can kind of put a few more in around there, where there might be a couple of gaps, especially if you've only got a little bit of yarn left like this. And then you can just kind of use it to bulk it up a bit. If you need to, you can always lift it out and take it over to another area like that and just fill that section in. It's always best to do it first time and fill it in that way, but if you miss bits, it's a good way to do it. But if you've jumped over a bit like this, afterwards I would always trim it down so that it's not pulling on it and it's not going to pull those loops out. And then that just makes all the difference, because when you turn it over, it just looks much more full. So now we're going to go on to some, what colour did I have next? It's kind of greeny, bluey texture colour. So you've got a few bits of this, so one there, and then this big section here. And when you've been doing lots of small sections, it's quite good to do a bigger section. So you've got a bulkier section filled in, so it kind of makes all of it look a bit more full, so it's looking a bit more like this bit at the top, and you can start to see how it's going to look in the end. So this bit starts here, goes down to there, and all around there. So we're going to do a little bit around here first, just to get that started. And then when you're filling in a bigger bit like this, that's got smaller areas in, just make sure to work around them, and then you can fill them in afterwards. Or if you turn it over and it looks okay as it is, you can leave smaller sections like that out. I wouldn't worry too much about all of the tails unless they're really getting in the way. Like these two here are a little bit longer, and they're going to start getting into some bits that we're going to work on. But if they're not in the way, I would leave them till the end. So when you do bits like this, it involves a lot of kind of moving around smaller sections. So when you get to those bits, just slow down a little bit. And then you can speed up when you're getting to the larger areas. So this bit, when there's not as many obstacles, you can just kind of keep going a little bit faster. And just keep remembering to unwind it as you go. And it is helpful sometimes to turn it so the direction you're going is facing away from you. Which gets tricky when you get to bits like this and you're kind of having to constantly turn it. So when you get to a bit like this, what I'd recommend doing is kind of, rather than going back around this bit, is just filling this section in. And then you can fill this bit in afterwards. Then pop your thumb on it or your finger on it, very carefully bring it out. And then you can start on this section and get that bit filled in. So then that section is all done. So if you turn it over, it might not, well, there are a few little gaps, but those bits we're going to fill in later. So you don't need to worry about them at the moment. I think, was there any more of that colour? So one little section over there. So just always keep referring back to your drawing and making sure that you're doing the right amount of each colour. this is it all finished off. So I hope you've enjoyed that and that you have a go yourself. We would love to see photos of what you make as well, so please do tag Artgecko in anything that you do. And I'll just show you some tips to finish it off. So you'll have lots of tails like this on the back. So I'd recommend just kind of trimming them down. You don't want to go all the way down to the bottom, because if you do, then it's more likely that the bits will come out. So you just trim them all down. So you can leave them, but generally if you leave them on, it's more likely you're going to pull one and pull out some of the work you've just done. So just go around giving it a little bit of a shave, getting any long bits off. And if you're going to turn it into a rug or a cushion or something, I'd recommend just putting some fabric glue on the back, and that just secures them all in, because they do generally stay in pretty well. But if it's something like that where it's going to be a bit more hard wearing, I'd recommend just a very, very thin layer of fabric glue on the back. And you can get punch needle specific fabric glue, but any fabric glue will do really. And that would just be really, really thin wash over, just to hold them all in. And once it's all trimmed on this side, I would turn it over and have a look on the other side, because it's probably going to be really, really neat over there, but there might always be a few little bits that stand out. So there we go, that is all pretty much cut down to a good height, so they're all kind of, there's still a little bit of them, but not too much. So on this side, we've got a few bits like these bits here that are standing out. So you just want to trim them down so that they're the same height as all of the other bits, so they don't really stand out too much. And there probably won't be that many, but they'll be very, very obvious. So just trim all of those down. And then generally, what I tend to do with this is, rather than using them as cushions or anything, I tend to have them as wall art. So a really easy way to do that is take it out of the frame and you're just going to swap it over. So this one's on the back, pop it on, and then put this back on the front and make sure it's really, really tight. Push it down, and you can either leave it like that, so you've got a wooden ring around it, or what I tend to do quite a lot of is getting the same colour thread that you've worked with before and stitching around the side. So the way you do that is trim this down so it's about up to this kind of level. So you've only got a couple of centimetres. Fold it under like that so it's all into there. So you could even leave this amount and just fold it all under. And then you'd get a really big-eyed needle. A plastic one works really well. And at each point, so on this one I would get some more of this yarn and just stitch from there around the side and back up through there, so that you're really tying it in. And it just gives you more of a kind of finished look to it, but you don't have to do that at all. And if you don't want to do that, what I'd recommend doing is rolling this all in, putting a bit of fabric glue underneath it to hold it in, and it should stay. If it doesn't, you can always do a small stitch from here into these, just being really careful not to pull your loops out as you go. And then it's all finished and ready to hang on a wall. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed that, and it was so much fun to do. I was using one of the classy gecko sketchbooks and one of the crafty ones as well, and they were absolutely lovely to work on. So thank you so much and have a lovely day.